So I'd like to welcome Jade Lotus to the Embracing Miracles podcast. Jade is a Tantric and Daoist teacher, and she has trained with the Daoist master Mantak Chia. And recently I was participating in one of her master classes, and the question arose about how do we foster a healthy sexuality in our children? And having just written an article about how we talk about death with children, I felt that there was an overlap between these two things. Both sex and death are taboos in our society, and we're often very awkward about the way we handle it with our children. So, Jade, welcome. And perhaps I can hand over to you and you can introduce yourself a little bit more and something about your journey, and then we can get into talking about children.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for having me here. So, as Rachel had mentioned, exactly, it's interesting this actually what you said, okay, that I work with Tantra and Taoism. When people think Tantra, they straight away think sex. I mean, I'm going to say what I teach has a lot more to do with Taoism, and Taoism has a lot more to do with sex than Tantra does, actually, as well. But, when people talk about working with sexuality, I mean, so much of what I work with in people is about emotions. And then to strip that back, it's about trauma, and I actually would say, anyone that's teaching about sexuality where they don't start off by going into emotions, by going into trauma, by going into what's blocking us from the natural free experience of our sexuality, which is something that would come naturally in a healthy, balanced person that was operating on their original programming. It's only going to be very, very shallow and surface if you don't start looking at that, because so much of when I say trauma, I'm talking here about emotions people experience that they're not processing. And in a sense, we're talking there about societal programming. So about the process of education, the process of moralization, the process of when we're taught how to be instead of being allowed to be our authentic selves and to flow through life as free people, as one would exist perhaps in a tribe in the jungle that was uncivilized. So yeah, I would say like very much a big part of what I'm doing is around emotions. I was literally just looking at a testimonial that a gentleman sent to me that we'd literally been working together for 2 weeks, and he'd had this 20 years of porn addiction. He was so nervous he couldn't talk to real life women. He was just very, very emotionally overwhelmed. Within 2 weeks, he was saying that all the interest of porn had gone out the window, and he was literally just feeling like a new person. His life had completely changed in a way it never happened before. And that was just through doing not even all the work around emotions I do, but just a small part of it, less than half of it, really. And it just goes to show how when we start unblocking our emotional field, so much starts to go right, already with our sexual energy. So so I would say, and I've had, obviously, you have, when you work in this kind of field, you get people criticizing you for all kinds of reasons. You get criticized for you might not be a good mother, right, because you work with sexuality, and all kinds of things like this that people can say, but in reality, yes, sexuality, it's a part of us. It's central to who we are. It's what creates us. But really, what I'm working with people is to bring people back to their authentic, genuine version of themselves, and to bring them back into their original programming, and then to get them to understand the energies within their body, which includes sexual energy, and allow them to live a life where they're actually free, because they're able to use the energies within their body in ways they desire, instead of being controlled by emotions and controlled by sexuality.
Yes. Yes, it's interesting actually, because I teach the grief recovery method, which is a program that's designed to help people identify their authentic emotions. And that brings a lot of release, especially after the death of someone. So I'm curious, because I've heard you talk about how to nurture a baby. Perhaps you could say something a little bit about that in relation, to the obviously a baby comes from a sexual act, and then we nourish our babies, and then they're growing into their own sexuality. So it's part of a continuum. We often forget that. We kind of divorce motherhood from our sexuality, but the two are very interlinked, as you were saying.
Well, children, and we don't like in our society to admit this, but children, they come from sex, right? And they do grow into sexual beings, and actually a lot younger than most people like to admit. So children tend to get the first burst of hormones, so to speak, around 3 to 4 years old, which leads to them touching their genitals, which they're often then admonished for. And children are already having a sense of sexuality before they're 10 years old. And this is something like almost nobody talks about, yet it's something that's a huge shadow, because I think it's estimated that about 10% of porn is watched by under 10 years old, that children are being exposed to it around 8, 9 years old. And they're starting to be influenced by something that is so, is so whack, compared to what healthy sexuality actually is. Yet when young children are watching it and they're seeing like the HD, the high-tech way in which it's created, the fact it's all presented, very slick, it starts to influence them, And I think part of the problem is children have questions, they want to know things, and they're asking adults and they're not being answered properly. They're being patronized by the adults, Another major issue, and at the time we were growing up, right, there was all these child rearing books that were encouraging mothers to leave their children screaming, not to breastfeed them or breastfeed them on a schedule. And actually, it seems like this treatment is actually like extremely, extremely traumatic to a child. And for a young boy, it starts to create a belief that women will always betray him, can be starting when he's 6 months old, 1 year old. He doesn't actually have a memory of that belief. And also when children are not getting healthy affection from us, it builds up a lot of tension in their body. They desire that affection, and the tension builds up, and the tension results then in there's nothing wrong with a child touching their genitals, but when a child is constantly masturbating, that is a sign of stress. When a child is getting on porn and needing to masturbate all the time, that's a definitely red flag that the child is suffering from stress. And that stress can be caused because the child isn't being allowed to be themselves. The child isn't being able to talk about their emotions, and just that lack of healthy, loving touch. Now, when my daughter was about a year old, someone, excuse me, that was a dog barking. Someone gifted me a book called The Continuum Concept. Do you know The Continuum Concept?
Yeah.
By Jade Lotus. And I read the book and it blew my mind and I almost cried. Yeah, I was really, really shocked. But luckily we got it. The thing was, a lot of things in the continuum concept we kind of knew already. Like, if she cried, there was no way I was leaving her to just cry on her own. I mean, the sound is so horrific, right? Yes. When the baby is crying for you as the mother, I mean, I breastfed her till she was 3, like whenever she wanted. We gave her a lot of love. And I mean, another thing, from when she was born, practically, I would talk to her like, really like she was an adult, and people would say, oh, she doesn't understand what you're saying, how, just laugh at me that I was treating her, that I wasn't going, oh, goo, 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 baby, or something like that, but she's like extremely intelligent. She's extremely well adjusted. I've never had to punish her. We've never punished her. And she's yet a very, very good girl who always wants to do the right thing. And I think that, one thing is that when the child feels it's having its needs met by the parent, it's going to trust you, and it's going to want to give you, it's going to want to make you happy. They're going to want to make you happy. And I mean, like in terms of a child's sexuality, I think we need to set them up, from a young age. We need to set them up to be comfortable with love, comfortable with healthy affection, to be comfortable with their emotions. In another way, naturally, sexuality develops on its own in a healthy way. I think that when we've given the kid the confidence, to say no, the confidence to be who they are, the confidence to do what they want, we can more or less trust it. Now, of course, there's the kid comes and asks us awkward questions, right, that we don't want to answer. I remember my daughter Mummy, how did two men have sex together? I think she was about 10 or something like that. And because the thing is as well, we've always been around animals. And I remember one of my friends, and she grew up on a farm, and she was like, well, sex was never a big thing for me because I was always around animals. So I saw animals having sex. I knew what sex was. And it wasn't like a massive thing, so it was kind of the same that she'd seen dogs and animals having sex. And, she knew it was just something that people and animals do, that it's just a natural part of life. But she asked me that, and I was like slightly taken aback, but then I just said, the penis is going in the anus instead of going into the vagina. She's just like, oh, really?
Yeah, just
But
something simple and matter of fact, isn't it? Just
yeah,
simple fact.
yeah. And the thing is, you want to be their go-to source for any information they want, because the last thing you want is your kid going and checking out on Google something, or, or asking the wrong person. I mean, one of my friends, he told me that when he said very young, I get the feeling like 10 years old or whatever, like an older man, like a fully grown adult, went to him and showed him how to find porn on his phone, and then started showing him how to masturbate. And he didn't tell his parents or whatever at the time. I guess he didn't feel able to, but he said, like, by the time he was like 14 or even less, he was like a porn addict, and he'd probably given it up by the time he was 17. But it's like a pretty traumatic thing for a kid to go through, you know.
And it's such
And
a formative time for children, isn't it? That
yeah,
16 to 17-year-old.
I think the sad fact is that the majority of kids are actually getting onto porn and watching porn these days, and it's absolutely like affecting the ability of kids to be able to experience healthy sexuality. So it's teaching men, males, boys, kids, to do quite brutal things to women and to want very extreme things with women. I
Mhm.
mean, even like actually an ex-boyfriend of mine, and he does watch porn sometimes. He's definitely not anti-porn anyways, but I remember talking to him a couple of years ago. He's still a good friend basically, and him saying to me that he said, you know what, I'm so glad I grew up when I did. Yeah, that we had to like fumble in the dark and have these awkward moments of like figuring things out, instead of being like some 14-year-old who's like watched 1,000 videos of women being raped and just thinks they know it all. And then when we think the poor girls are going into sex, and maybe they've watched porn and they've got some crazy exaggerated idea about how they need to behave, or
Mm-mm.
haven't watched it and they have some romantic idea, and then boys are like pressuring them into things that you're not ready for at that age. um And I mean, it does concern me, like, and now you see like a lot of young girls walking around, I just see this look in them. I just find really, really concerning. Like they look really like they're not understanding inner values, like everything, like they're so sexualized. I think that's the right word. They look so sexualized, which obviously is coming from like a lack of confidence within themselves. Anyways,
Yeah.
the fact they feel like that. So I think as parents, like, I mean, the main things being like that our child feels they can honestly talk to us, that we don't, they say things we're not comfortable with, and then we shut them up, and then we don't know what's going on, and when we do that, we're risking the fact like our child could become someone who sexually victimizes another person, or they could be sexually victimized the other way. It's something that, we as parents, we need to take seriously. But when we ourselves don't have a healthy relationship with our own sexuality, it then makes it like very it's almost inevitable that we're passing things on to our children that then is going to end up being harmful to them, that they're somehow going to end up having to heal from in one way or another, or it's going to affect their ability to experience love, connection, and intimacy, and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I really resonate with that. When my oldest daughter, who's now an adult, came to me, and she was young, and she was asking something, and I made a joke. I just had no idea that she might be sexually active, or, even though I'm quite open. So I closed that conversation down for a while, and it
Mm,
opened up again later. But I realized how easy it is to close these conversations down inadvertently. Um,
mm, mm,
and I've reflected a lot on that since, because I've got younger daughters growing up now. Um, And I resonate with what you describe, you know, the breastfeeding and holding your baby close. You know, my youngest daughter, you know, I would have her strapped in a little pouch, and I some days I'd get to the end of the day and think, oh my goodness, I haven't looked at the baby. You know, I'd just been busy and she'd just been tucked in and she could feed when she wanted. And actually, of the four of them, she's the most chill. You know, so maybe just being tucked in a pouch all day was fine. Just that constant body contact.
Thing
Um,
is, we actually develop our sexuality. We naturally would develop our sexuality in a very healthy way. Jean Lidloff, right, who wrote the continuum concept, and she was living with the Yaquana in Venezuela for 2.5 years, I think back in the 60s or the 70s, and she was watching the way the children develop, and she was commenting on people's just the way people were, people's sexuality, I suppose, as well. And she was just saying people would just naturally pair bond for life. Now, my part of my family are Indigenous Americans from South America as well, and I know that in Indigenous American culture, masturbation is not a thing that people really do. Most Westerners are really surprised when they hear this. But I read that in that book, yeah, that it's in Native Americans, they don't know about, they're not full of all this tension that Western Christianized people are, that they need to grab their penises and go like this to kind of release the tension out of their body, basically, And even a friend of mine recently who stayed with some Indigenous people in Mexico, he was saying, they said the same thing. They said, don't masturbate, just feel the energy and allow it to, spread out. And I also heard the same thing from a friend who comes from this. He says it's the number one of the voodoo villages in all of Ghana, right? So very traditional way of life. And he said, I would say that in my country, about 80% of men do not masturbate and watch porn. And it's generally considered like a bit of a weird thing to do and an unhealthy thing to do and a not very masculine thing to do as well. So it's quite interesting that, in Western culture, it's kind of become equated with sexual liberation, right? The use of porn. When in reality, it's not that looking at images of naked people or even images of sex can be educational, it can be fine, but that's not what the porn industry is showing people, you know? And in the tribe, the Yaquana tribe where she was staying, she was just saying, that people pair bonded for life, and there was no sexual harassment, there was no rape, there was no, all the things we complain about today, they just didn't happen, and nobody, was telling people what to do. In fact, people wouldn't even tell the children that's dangerous, don't do that, or anything like that. Nobody told kids what to do, right? Which was pretty crazy. And she was describing how the children were like babies were lying on the edge of this like 2-meter drop. Nobody would try to stop them or whatever, because they actually knew not to fall. And she was even describing a mother was breastfeeding the baby. So the baby, there's all these machetes lying on the floor, and the babies are playing with the machetes. And this mom is breastfeeding the baby, and the baby's swinging a machete like a 9-month-old baby. But he doesn't cut his mom. He doesn't cut himself. And we would be like, imagine if social services walked in and I had babies lying on the edge of cliffs and playing with machetes. But she said there was far less injuries happening to children in their culture than
I guess
happens.
it's to do with fear. It's an
Because there's a
introduction to fear.
sense of what's safe and what's right. And our education and so on and so forth actually teaches people, it tries to teach people a certain way to be, but that's not the human way to be. So by trying to civilize us, in a sense, they're actually kind of turning people into savages. But another thing in Ghana, because I visited Ghana, and you can basically like just leave your laptop and your phone just lying around like in a bus stop, like a big bus stop, walk off, come back. People don't take your stuff or steal your stuff. It's really interesting. And apparently a lot of Africa, obviously the more westernized places, you're going to find theft, but a lot of Africa is like that. People aren't going to just steal or, in Ghana, you saw women and children walking down dark roads late at night, just on their own, didn't seem at all feel unafraid. So,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's elements within every culture. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Ethiopia, and there's female circumcisions practiced. So, you know, the like a very violent intervention of a woman's sexuality. But when our bodies are nurtured and allowed the freedom to develop,
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's when we are much more intuitively in touch with our sexuality.
Absolutely. We're naturally, and you mentioned female circumcision, and I would say put all circumcision in that. And they know, that Naomi Wolf writes about this in her book, Vagina. I don't know if you've read the book Vagina, but she talks about how when women are raped or sexually assaulted, or indeed they have circumcision, right? It actually literally like shuts down their voice, so they can't speak. And this is actually, I dated a Somali guy for about 5 years, and he told me that one of his cousins, who was living in England as well, was put in jail. I think she burgled a house or something. Then they sent her back to Somalia. I think she was like 20 or something like that, and to maybe hopefully reform her or whatever. And she was in Mogadishu, and they were all saying, oh, look, this girl, she's she's got too much energy, she speaks too much, we should like cut off her clitoris. This is literally what they were saying, just to kind of subdue her, basically. It's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, Naomi Wolf's book on this subject is very, very interesting. And she says, and I get her point for sure, that rape, it's very common in our culture, rape of some sort, sexual violence. She talks specifically about American culture, where there actually are, like, it sounds crazy, but on some college campuses, they actually have literally pro-rape demonstrations by male students, and pro-rape posters, pro-rape memes, and all this, saying things like, there's no such thing as rape, it's just surprise sex, and stuff like that. So, and imagine these guys are protesting pro-rape, right? When the girls are protesting, saying that stop rape, and the guys are, and then the cops don't stop them, and nobody does anything about it. They're not punished or whatever. And it is just like, she's saying there is this agenda to just basically silence women by having them, sexually assaulted and sexually interfered with. And I mean, even though we don't think of it as abuse, like, no, few people would say, I think, that if you're not hugging your child, you're not feeding them enough, or, and so on, that few people would say that's sexual abuse, or that's abuse. People would say, oh, well, you're teaching them to, what do they say? Like, be more disciplined.
Independent.
And, a little 3-month-old independent baby or whatever, it's so silly, right? But I work with men who have no reason for why you would think they are traumatized. And fortunately, the way I work with people, you don't need to be able to say, oh, they're traumatized because of whatever happened when they were 3 months old or whatever, but there's a lot of men having difficulty with relationships because they weren't hugged enough as a child. They weren't, they have this feeling of betrayal towards their mother that they don't understand, that then plays out in relationships that they have with other females. And obviously it makes pornography a lot more attractive, because the porn is not going to turn around and hurt you. It's not going to deny you love. And porn offers this like sex without love. So you take the emotions out of it, you take the love out of it. It's so simple. You just whack one off to whatever video. And, it seems to be kind of offering this solution in a world where just increasingly we are dehumanized in so many different ways. And I guess it's a way of dehumanized sex,
Yes.
but when you look at our sexuality, sexuality is very, very human, or even animalistic to have sexuality. So when you're stripping away what comes with it, such as love and emotion, it's a real like dehumanization. So when people talk about, whenever people talk about conspiracies, I think conspiracy theories are fun to listen to, but I also think a lot of stuff, there's a lot of rather than malice, it's incompetence or whatever, but I guess it's somehow appealed to a certain wounding within people, that this electronic sex or whatever you want to call it is like a cure for for all these pains and ills that people seem to have.
Yeah, and I've heard you talking about toxic masculinity, and I mean, that's a phrase that, I mean, I guess I hadn't heard that phrase, but I just certainly grew up with the idea that men were by and large all dangerous and you needed one man that would protect you from all the others. But then when I was studying feminism at university, like the whole idea of toxic masculinity, in a way, amplified that, except it got rid of the idea that we might need a man to protect us, that we could do that for ourselves. But I've heard you really shift that, looking at the dangers of this kind of language for men. Like, where do men find themselves when we're all talking about toxic masculinity? What's a nourishing expression of masculinity, and how do we discover that for our sons?
Yeah, I mean, Rachel, I've worked in various ways one-on-one with like several thousand men. Yeah. If you add to that, like the men that, when men find out what I do, yeah, you can imagine they open up and share all kinds of things, as well. So imagine like how many men I've heard, talking. And I would just say there's actually very, very few men in this world that are just outright malicious, and one cause harm, 1% or something like that. Sure, there's confused people that are in pain, but actually one of the most powerful, strongest drives of a male is the so-called hero drive, right? That makes a man want to save women, like a knight in shining armor is more powerful actually than the sex drive, the hero drive, right? So men, they want to do well, but like we women, they haven't been taught about sexuality. But the difference is male sexuality is extremely volatile. Is the sexual energy is much more volatile than it is for females. Plus, add to that the fact that men have probably repressed more emotions, and the more emotions we're repressing, there's a good chance it's going to make the sexuality even more volatile. I mean, I was talking to a young man the other day, and he was just telling me, he said, I'm so confused about my sexuality. Good looking young guy, 29 years old or 27 or something, I don't know. But, he's saying, I'm so confused about my sexuality because I feel it. I feel all this energy, then I feel all these negative feelings coming up, of course, because sexual energy amplifies what's already there, so men are experiencing all this confusing stuff they don't feel that they can talk about. Then we as women tend to be there just casting stones at them. I mean, a lot of them have a trauma literally around the fact they have a penis, and they've been shamed for having a penis, made to feel like a penis is a weapon. I used to buy into this stuff because I didn't used to understand men as well, like so many of us do, because women are traumatized, and we've been traumatized going back for centuries and centuries and centuries. Most of us have ancestors who've been literally killed for growing a lavender plant or having an orgasm or smiling or literally being, a female. Like millions of women like lost their lives over centuries in this crazy, witch hunt or whatever around women. So we do hold a lot of trauma, but what many of us women concluded was that, we want to turn men into women, yeah, which is not what we need, yeah, because what we really need to heal is men being men, but being really in their masculine, and it's a very, very symbiotic relationship. If you look at the yin and the yang symbol, the way it is, and the way the one dot of the other is in, the center of the other, and so on. And certainly, like, people can make criticisms and say, well, more women are doing healer work than men. I mean, I will just say I work with just such beautiful, incredible, amazing men that really just want to, become the best versions of themselves, and they didn't know how to, and when you just see them just given a few tips, and the way they start to change and the way they start to transform, it's just it's just really incredible to see how they can start to grow and shift and just become comfortable in who they are and comfortable with their emotions. It's a huge part of it, like I said at the beginning, and with their sexuality. as well. So, there's toxic masculinity. There's also plenty of toxic femininity floating around as well. Let's be honest, that as well. And, there's just a lot of toxicity around everything to do with sex, biological sex, gender sex, sexual intercourse. It's almost like that there's this war against us as sexual beings, and this war against our bodies where people just never feel like they're enough. And yeah, so I mean, as I healed myself from my own wounding as a child, because I was hurt by my father, I was hurt by other men as well as a child. And I had a very difficult, even though I've always had a lot of male friends, I had a difficult time in being in my feminine with men and opening to them. Whereas as I've grown older and as I've started to heal that, I just find like more and more wonderful, amazing men have been coming into my life as I'm slowly opening to them. But I can see just as much at the same time that through that process, men were appearing in my life that allowed me to heal as well.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
So,
I mean, you were talking about how kind of the male energy is strong, quite volatile. And I think there's a flip side to that. A woman's sexual energy is powerful, and we often don't want to discuss that with our daughters. I've sort of celebrated my daughter's first period, and these things where we celebrate a woman's cyclical body. And it seems to me that sometimes, like, one of my daughter's friends, I invited her to have a little party with us, and she was like, oh, no, we just treat that as matter of fact. And I think for both boys and girls, we need to be finding a way where they can find the power within their sexuality.
Definitely. I mean, and you just say we women, we are incredibly powerful. I mean, look at men, yeah, they're going to get aroused and they can come in like a few minutes. As a woman can go on and on and on for hours and hours, having like more and more orgasms. And also, I do think like we are more intelligent than men. We're more capable of doing many, many things than men. Look, companies with female CEOs tend to outperform those with male CEOs in terms of profit by 10%. So I think that we, as much as women have been kind of turned into these little frail beings, but I think we actually need to take our power back and step back into our power and actually like own our power, which I think a lot of women are intimidated by it. We're programmed to
The
be
power to give birth is remarkable, and it's not that every woman is going to have a baby, but we nonetheless all have this energy within us.
Yeah.
And yet we're taught that birth is something that has to take place in hospitals.
Yeah, like as if women are going to as if we're so incapable, and there's all this talk, and it's not to say people haven't died in childbirth. I mean, people have. I know someone whose mother died giving birth to him, actually, which is incredibly traumatic for him. But most women in most births are capable exactly to give birth, So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was after the orgasmic birth. I didn't quite find it, but these things are just not part of our discourse. They're not the way we talk about our bodies and our sexuality. So I guess a lot of nourishing a healthy sexuality for our children is finding it for ourselves. And we're finding it that each generation has its own backdrop, doesn't it? And for me, it was kind of a religious framing of that. And then sort of through the lens of feminism, the kind of the discourse around toxic masculinity. And now what you're describing for the next generation is this kind of digitized access to sexuality that divorces it from the body.
And from the humanity and from love, because, love is, we say in Daoism, sexuality is 50% love and 50% orgasmic energy.
Right. So 50% orgasmic energy, that's a big proportion of our experience, balance this experience of love.
Mm,
Yeah, and
yeah.
if could you suggest any kind of exercise that we might do with our children? Um,
You know, I bought my daughter these two books by someone called Lisa Spillane. And one of them is called Smiling Heart Meditations. The other one's called The Six Healing Sounds, right? And I think you were in my masterclass the other day where, and the heart is very, very important. And I think in these days when we're supposed to have all this sexual liberation, love and the heart has really taken a knock, you
yeah.
know.
Mhm.
So when we like connect into our hearts, it's very, very important to connect in our hearts and to feel love in our hearts. This is something I got my daughter doing from quite a young age. Actually, just smile to your heart, shut your eyes, connect to your heart, smile to your heart, and just feel love and grow love, and be very comfortable in this energy center and with this energy of love. And the more that we're growing this love within our hearts, it's a very, very protective energy because it's the energy of fire. This is why Jesus says, love your enemy, because you're actually putting a fire between you and your enemy to stop them from hurting you. Yeah. So I think teaching kids to be heart-centered is a really, really great place to start. And I think just having them to be really comfortable about talking about their emotions, allowing them to talk about their emotions as well, giving them plenty of hugs. I think laughing about things, letting them be themselves, being cool, being chilled, these are all important things. So, and obviously, well, I would say having the child doing sports, being fit, being active too. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
very in the body.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you, Jade. That's been so fascinating. Just really thinking about our children in this way, in this the context of our culture that throws so many different stories about sexuality at us.
Children are very sexualized and then at the same time, demonized. Yeah,
Yes, yes.
and demonized child sexuality is demonized. But when we do this, we're actually doing the opposite of sexualization. We're desexualizing them when we allow them to be authentic and genuine.
Yes. Yes,
Mm.
that resonates for me. My daughter went to a school that had been founded by Krishnamurti, and
Mhm.
there were no devices allowed in the public rooms. And so, but equally, they were all expected to clean the school and participate in taking care of the school. So
Mhm.
they all had their duties. So they were given responsibilities and they were treated as if they were quite mature. But
Mhm.
because there weren't many devices, the way they interacted was very playful. So as if they could be children again. So it was lovely. They were both respected and enabled to be playful. And I just thought how different that was from her experiences in other contexts where children are often spoken down to or not expected to be responsible, but equally are often on devices separated from each other.
Well, when we treat them like, mature adults, they behave like them.
Thank you for watching the Embracing Miracles podcast. If you would like to know how the grief recovery method can help you move beyond the pain of loss, book a free session with me using the link below.